Corporatism and Comparative Politics, the Other Great Ism, by Howard J. Wyatta, 1997. Excerpts read by Jim Kelly. Chapter 5, The Dynamics of Change in Corporatist Systems. Traditional, historic, or what we have called natural corporatism may come in a great variety of forms. Traditional corporatism refers to the basic, historic, grassroots organizational units on which early society is structured. Of course, these may take different forms in different cultural areas, but the basic units are usually the family, the clan or extended family, and the tribe, parish, caste, association, or neighborhood group. Note that these units are usually limited in size and geographic distance. They existed before the onset of modern communications, transportation, and bureaucratic organization enabled larger units to be brought together. As industrialization continued, the urban proletariat and their organized labor groups continued to grow and become more powerful. It was one thing to suppress a few hundred radical workers, but it was quite another in terms of the social and political costs involved to suppress thousands or even millions. Not only were the numbers of organized workers growing, but in Marxism, anarchism, syndicalism, socialism, and eventually Bolshevism, they were finding ideologies that gave them organizing and unifying principles that frightened the traditional power holders to their foundations. Hence, there began to grow in the late 19th century, principally on the part of elite groups, a less repressive, more positive view of the social question. Instead of suppressing the ever-growing unions by sending the police or army out to squash them, the new strategy was to bring them into the fold, to incorporate them into the political system, but under state control. This strategy would now involve both repression in some circumstances and co-optation, both carrots, inducements, and sticks, restraints. How best to do this? The answer was a new, revived form of corporatism. The corporatist solution, as proposed by a host of writers in the late 19th century and by Pope Leo XIII in the encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891, was to set up a corporatist system of representation including labor, capital, and the state, in which the state, still controlled by the elites, would be the decisive partner. It should be recalled that, at this stage, out-of-control capitalistic entrepreneurs were seen by the state and by the Pope as almost as much of a threat, but not quite, as were undisciplined, but now newly organized workers. This concern reflected both the political preoccupations about an added or new social group, big business, that was growing increasingly wealthy and powerful, and also traditional Roman Catholic sensibilities going back to the Middle Ages about capitalism as representing illegitimate usury. Hence, both organized labor and owners and management were to be brought into the political system on a supposedly co-equal basis, but under the state's direction and control. Class harmony would be substituted for the looming Marxist threat of class conflict. A well-ordered society would thus be maintained, evoking the medieval ideal, but new and threatening groups, labor and capital, would be co-opted in. The existing structure of Victoria England or Bismarckian Germany would be maintained, but new corporatist pillars would be added on to the system. This corporatist solution to the social question, in addition, soon spread beyond the mainly Catholic officials and intellectuals who had been instrumental in promulgating it in its early years to include many Protestant writers and officials, as well as non-religious, more secular officials. To all these groups, this updated version of corporatism was tremendously attractive because it both preserved traditional power hierarchies while also adjusting to change. It provided a means to absorb new and rising groups into the political system, but without this producing fragmentation or breakdown. It is small wonder, therefore, that corporatism would be so attractive. Modern neo-corporatism is both an extension of the earlier practices and a new and altered form of corporatism. Neo-corporatism grew out of the new prosperity of Western Europe in the 1960s and 1970s, not out of poverty, deprivation, and limited resources had the earlier 1930s-style corporatism. Neo-corporatism tends to come in modern, developed, industrial nations, not in traditional or transitional ones. Whereas the earlier forms of manifest corporatism were products of industrialization and the new social groups it spawned, neo-corporatism is the product of what some call post-industrialism or the modern welfare state. Neo-corporatism is also democratic, participatory, and social justice oriented. It seeks to bring in and involve in democratic, participatory decision-making the very groups that the earlier corporatism sought to regulate and control. Modern neo-corporatism, in short, was a product of the prosperous, more affluent 1960s and of modern post-industrial social welfarism. Modern neo-corporatism involved 4 major policy areas, and the list kept expanding. One was economic policy, which also came to include industrial policy, on such issues as wages, working conditions, hours, pensions, vacations, and the targeting of industrial priorities. Organized labor was not only consulted on the major questions, but was also brought into the process of economic planning and even implementation. Similarly, on Social Security and welfare policy, not only were labor and the other beneficiaries of these programs consulted, but they were also brought into the decision-making process and often given formal representation on the regulatory boards and government agencies that decided such policies. Much of the same occurred with healthcare, education, and other public policies. These groups affected were not only consulted, but literally got a seat at the table and were incorporated into both decision-making and the actual implementation of the policy. This is clearly a more inclusionary, more participatory form of corporatism. In fact, the changes were so significant that they represented a new type of corporatism. Under neo-corporatism, the participating groups perform at least 4 major functions. First, they represent the interests of the group and serve as intermediaries between the group and government agencies. Second, since they sit in on and often have seats assigned to them in these government agencies, they perform deliberative functions, helping to hammer out government policy on specific issues. Third, these groups have regulative functions, especially the regulation, policing, and setting of professional standards for their own members. And fourth, these groups perform implementation functions, helping to carry out the very programs that they have helped design. In other words, under neo-corporatism, the participating groups are involved in all facets of the policy-making process as it affects their particular policy areas, from initial identification of problem areas to consultation and drafting bills, to lobbying and exerting political pressure, to implementation. Under neo-corporatism, therefore, business and labor are no longer just private interest associations as they are under interest group pluralism. Rather, they cross the line to become quasi-public or even fully public agencies. They regularly receive subsidies from the state for their activities. Their leaders and staffs are often paid by the state, and they frequently lobby the state, now from their inside the bureaucracy positions, for greater funds and resources. While this kind of constant neo-corporative interaction between the state and corporative groups can be, and often is, efficient and beneficial, one can see all kinds of potential conflicts of interest arising from these arrangements. For these are now public or quasi-public agencies, but to whom are they responsible? To whom are they accountable? Not to the electorate. which has no say in determining the policies or leaders of these groups, and maybe not even to their own members, from whom the leaders are often insulated? And what of the conflict involved in these groups using public funding to lobby from inside the government for even greater funding for their own activities, again with no or limited public knowledge of these activities or accountability? In becoming fully or quasi-public agencies, these neo-corporatist arrangements have probably improved policymaking, but at the cost of less public scrutiny and oversight. In a democracy, this is a dangerous development. An even graver threat is that, under neo-corporatism, the political system becomes so overloaded, so saturated with corporative interest groups now located inside rather than outside the bureaucracy and the structure of decision-making, that the entire system goes into gridlock, becomes paralyzed with competing interests, and breaks down into chaos and ungovernability. That may now be becoming the situation in such countries as Argentina, Great Britain, Italy, or the United States, where, instead of improving public policy making, neo-corporatism has led to such an embedded system of entitlements and special privileges for the involved groups that it is producing political sclerosis and breakdown. Powerful, entrenched, and competing, yet balanced, interest groups that are located inside the political system, which is the essence of neo-corporatism, are producing paralysis at a time of declining public revenues and disillusionment with often wasteful and inefficient government programs, especially those programs in which a quasi-private, quasi-public neo-corporative group proves greedy, enjoys lavish entitlements, or squanders public resources. These are the elements that are fueling our own public malaise and the profound dissatisfaction of voters with government, especially big government. But these are precisely the features that characterize neo-corporatism. Our present political crisis is therefore, in essence, a crisis of neo-corporatism. Chapter 6, Creeping Corporatism in the United States. The United States was founded on principles of individualism, laissez-faire, and freedom, both in the economic and political marketplaces. All of these characteristics are usually thought to be inimical to corporatism, and they are and have been historically. So Americans do not like to hear about corporatism. That is for other countries. But it is the thesis of this chapter that the United States does practice corporatism, and does so increasingly. We are, and have been, experiencing a form of creeping corporatism. However, we seldom call it that, and most Americans are ill-equipped to recognize it when it appears. We lack the terminology. We also lack the comparative perspective from other nations that would enable us to use their experience with corporatism to cast light upon our own. The United States was founded on a basis that was free and individualistic, unencumbered by the obligations of such pre-modern corporative institutions as clans, tribes, estates, or feudal orders. It is a product of the Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformation, capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, the revolution in scientific thinking ushered in with Galileo and Newton, and the revolution leading to limited government and democracy that was consolidated in England and Holland in the 17th century. All of these profound changes may be identified with the modern world, not with the medieval one of historic corporatism. The United States stresses rights, but they are individual rights, not corporate or group rights. And while we have lots of interest groups operating in our political system, these are free and independent interest groups. Unlike in corporatist systems, these groups were not created by the state, nor are they licensed, controlled, and dominated by it. The autonomy that such groups enjoy is part of the larger picture which we have painted, now changing, of an economy and polity dominated by freedom and individualism, unfettered by historic corporatism. Without a feudal past, with seemingly boundless resources, with an apparently endless frontier that always enabled one to start anew, and heavily influenced by the modern notions of freedom and individualism, The United States began life as a nation in a singularly advantageous position. It had no past to overcome, no strong medieval roots, none of the entrenched corporative ties, obligations, and barriers that other nations had to struggle to break free of before freedom and democracy could be established. It was not until President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s that a peacetime form of corporatism became a part of U.S. government institutions and policy. A number of factors were involved. First, some of Roosevelt's key advisors, his brain trust, such as Adolph A. Burrell, Jr., were committed to corporatist solutions to the social and economic problems of the Depression. Second, quite a number of businessmen, despite their commitments to a laissez-faire economy, saw the value of heading off a radical challenge from organized labor by bringing labor into the political process and giving it certain benefits, the familiar co-optive strategy of corporatism. Third, Roosevelt himself saw the value of expanding his political base by moving toward greater pluralism and incorporating organized labor into the Democratic Party coalition. Fourth, even in an era of isolationism, European ideas of corporatism, then widespread, were seeping into the United States and finding receptive audiences. By the 1960s, it was clear that something more than traditional interest group liberalism and pluralism, among the glories of the U.S. political system, was at work. The United States was going beyond pluralism toward corporatism. Note how far beyond interest group pluralism the United States had come. This was no longer just interest groups vying for political influence. This was interest groups operating within the system, operating from inside, being incorporated into the state system of cabinet ministries and other agencies. Note also that, as under corporatism, all the main economic groups were so incorporated: farm groups, big business, big labor. Soon other groups of smaller businessmen would similarly hive off for themselves other federal agencies, such as the Small Business Administration. This merging and blurring of private groups and public agencies is what corporatism is all about. The trends toward increased corporatization of American society and politics were greatly accelerated by the Great Society programs of President Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. Johnson greatly expanded welfare programs, all arguably good, but then largely turned the running of these programs to the welfare groups and their advocates, again blurring the line between public and private and providing for a certain corporatization of welfare. Johnson expanded the federal government's role in education and created the Department of Education, but then he allowed, even encouraged, the National Education Association, part of Johnson's political constituency, basically to take over and run this new department. Similarly, a greater federal government role in health care opened the door for health care advocates, health maintenance organizations, and nurses and doctors associations to dominate the health care field, once more for their own private interests and not necessarily to serve the broader public good. Meanwhile, under both John F. Kennedy and Johnson, tripartite boards incorporating business, government, and labor were established to supervise wage and price controls, another step on the road to corporatism. Over the course of 2 or 3 decades, it seemed as if every interest group and every sector of U.S. society, in one form or another, had their hooks into the system. These ostensibly private groups not only placed their own personnel in many public agencies, but also then moved to take over these agencies for themselves, using their inside access and influence to channel grants, contracts, and patronage back to their own groups. This is more than the symbiosis of corporatism. It verges on incest and is rife with conflict of interest. For example, in some of the agencies that the author knows best, such as the U.S. Agency for International Development, the main U.S. Foreign Aid and Development Agency, various private population control groups had largely taken over the family planning program. The women's groups had a virtual monopoly on the Woman and Development Program. Environmental groups had moved in on the Sustainable Development Program, and other groups had hived off other parts of USAID's activities. Now, no one denies that these private groups should be able to lobby on behalf of their own agenda. That is what interest group liberalism is all about. But being incorporated into public agencies, taking them over in some cases, siphoning off grants and contracts, and using public funds and facilities to pursue a private agenda, that goes beyond interest group liberalism. That is corporatism. And with so many private groups now dependent on and having inside access to the money and patronage of ostensibly public agencies, the corporatization of U.S. public policymaking went forward inexorably. Given this penetration of U.S. public agencies by so many private groups, it is easy to see why reforming this system would be difficult. Too many groups have too big a stake in the public bureaucracy to allow change to go forward. By the 1980s and 1990s, as other calls began to be heard to slow, halt, or even dismantle this mushrooming corporatist system, it became clear that corporatism was so deeply entrenched that the reform or reversal of it would prove nearly impossible. In the language of the time, the United States had become a nation of entitlements. So many groups had so many mitts into so many public programs and were so incorporated into the governmental system that, in effect, the political culture had changed. As contrasted with the earlier values and even ideology of American individualism, laissez-faire, and individual initiative and responsibility, the United States had, at least at some levels, incorporated an ideology of groupism, of collective entitlements, of quotas, economic, ethnic, social, racial, and geographic. The corporatized group system had become so strong that it embodied huge sectors of the population, several of which, such as labor, business, teachers, women, military, African Americans, were sufficiently strong that they had effective veto power over reform. Teachers' unions could block educational reforms, for example, while the military-industrial complex could block Department of Defense budget reductions. It was the actions of these powerful, vested, corporatized interests, along with the partisan split between Congress and the executive branch, that accounted for the frequent paralysis and gridlock of American policymaking in the 1980s and 1990s. A U.S.-style corporate state has arrived, unsung, unheralded, and almost never mentioned. The emergence of corporatism has to do with the parallel emergence of big labor, big agriculture, big business, big universities, big defense, big welfare, and big government, all operating in a symbiotic relationship. It also has to do with the growth of modern social policy, with the government assuming a greater role in the management of the economy, with the greater emphasis on group rights and group entitlements over individual rights, and with the growth of a large administrative state regulatory apparatus. Among its implications are the merging of the public and private sectors, the delegation of public power to private interest associations, and the increased central government consolidation of economic and political power. Conclusion. Corporatism is widespread in both developed and developing nations. The next question is it democratic? Can it be made both responsive to public policy needs and responsible to the electorate? These are large and difficult questions. The author's position is that he is not a corporatism ideologue or advocate, but as a social scientist, he sees corporatism continuing to be present in a variety of regimes, perhaps increasingly more so. It cannot be wished away, and therefore we need both to recognize it and deal with it realistically. Moreover, since corporatism is associated with big government, large-scale interest groups, big bureaucracy, and modern social and economic policy, it is likely that, in the future, as many countries move in these directions, we will see more corporatism rather than less. Such corporatist development is not inherently evil, unless we allow the changes ushered in to lead to greater separation between bureaucratic corporatist decision-making and active citizen participation and oversight. In any corporatist regime, however, the temptation is often strong and the bureaucratic pressure such to separate decision-making on important social and economic issues from democratic participation and responsibility. If corporatism is not only here to stay, but often expanding in modern and modernizing states, then we, as citizens, need to make sure that it remains a democratic, pluralist, and responsible form of corporatism, and not an authoritarian, irresponsible form divorced from citizen participation and oversight. All these comments point to the conclusion that corporatism in its several manifestations and forms will be with us for a long time to come. And since there also seem to be many new policy arenas in which corporatism is present, and many transmutations of older into newer forms of corporatism, the corporatist approach offers seemingly endless opportunities for new areas of study and research. It also raises a host of important moral, political, and citizenship issues.